Hello and welcome to Reiki Women Podcasts. Today I have with me the lovely women, wherever they are around me. There's Michaela in the ether, Carrie in the ether, we're there. And I'm here too. And it's freezing where I am. And it's obviously bloody hot where you are, Michaela. Yes.
So hot.
And Carrie's the in-between girl.
Just a little lukewarm over here.
I feel like that plays well with our topic today, right?
It does. Yeah. We're fitting into the whole zen of everything here. All right. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about non-duality and what on earth it has to do with us and our lives and who we are and what we're doing and our practice as Reiki practitioners. Okay. So a good place to start would just be to have a little quick chat about the system of Reiki. So the system of Reiki is a Japanese practice. And from that, we know that there are a number of different elements within the system of Reiki that are Japanese in culture and in religion. So we have different influences, and some of those are from Zen, Buddhism, and Shintoism. So we have those sort of Japanese aspects. If we look at non-duality, we can trace that back through to China, for example. So we could go back with Buddhism through to China, and then we could trace that down into India to the Vedic teachings there. And we might see that as the beginning of the origins of the idea of non-duality. And I think Carrie, who is a yoga teacher, will be able to enlighten us about that a little more later on. So if we move forward into the future now and our practice in the system of Reiki and what non-duality has to do with that, we can see it in a number of places. I'm going to mention one, but look, you guys probably have got more examples. But one really stark example for me is that to show that that's what we're actually working with. And one of the ways that we work with our practice is with the symbols and the mantras. So if we take symbol 1 and the first mantra, and we take second symbol and mantra of the system of Reiki, we can see that they are dual elements. So one represents earth, one represents heaven, and we have that really simple understanding of these two different entities that are apparently different. Yeah, so they are separate. And yet then we have symbol 3 and the mantra 3, and that represents almost like the coin. So it's like bringing the two together. So we have the two sides of the coin, and then we have the actual coin itself. So it's us learning step by step about how to move into this non-dual space practice, and practicing first with the first symbol and the first mantra, moving into the second symbol and mantra, and then into the third symbol and mantra. So going through those steps, we're actually following through this idea of moving into a non-dual space and existing in that. But goodness knows, what does that mean? And that is what we're here today to talk about. And, there are different ways that we also practice with it in the system of Reiki, but that's one very clear and obvious practice that we have. So I would like to throw it out there. Maybe we should start way back in the times of the Vedic Hindu world. And I'd be really interested to know a little bit about non-duality coming from there. Carrie.
Yeah, great. Well, I think, if you look back at a lot of these concepts that we explore within Reiki, certainly there's roots of it that extend all the way back to India, like Bronwen mentioned. And that's really been a place of study for me for many years. Although I'd say that, if you're confused about non-duality, you're not alone. It's usually a very kind of top-heavy topic, very esoteric topic, and somewhat hard to put it down into real life terms that make sense to us, in our day-to-day lives. So we're going to try to go into that more towards the end of our episode, I think. But, how I understand non-duality showed up within the Indian subculture is, a long period of time where the philosophy in yoga and Hinduism, I should say, was essentially a dual philosophy, meaning that God and, spirit and, pretty much those things were seen as something other than ourselves, and particularly other than our body. And so if you're familiar with a text called the Yoga Sutras, it's like the foundation text of yoga. It's actually a dual book. And if you look at the way it's written, it's really about transcending the limits of the body, seeing the body as somewhat polluted, undivine, and yet trying to transcend all of that to find a supreme realization. Of course, the Yoga Sutras are only really the starting point of yoga. And it threads together a lot of different thoughts that came, before yoga. But then from the Yoga Sutras onwards, there's this whole evolution of, different types of yoga that took those texts and elaborated on them, changed them, modified them, or, evolved them. And that gave rise to non-duality within yoga. And at one point, so traditionally, yoga at the time of the Yoga Sutras was practiced by renunciant men. Not accessible to women by any means. And in order to be a yogi, you had to renounce the whole world, renounce all your possessions, and you lived in a cave. And, that was the lifestyle, that was the path. And renounce all of, our worldly possessions. And so at some point within that evolution, and I don't have like the whole timeline in front of me, although we could get super geeky about that too. But at some point, that whole concept was revolutionized, or just really flipped on its head, and started talking about how God is within us, and that the universe is made of matter and spirit. And there's just like this melding, this merging of both of them together, and that we're both of these things. And so starting to move in that direction of non-duality. And then I'd say there's like even a further evolution from my understanding, just Tantra. And Tantra means, is this philosophy that, God is in everything. And you can see it contrasted in like the first, dual aspect, where the body is undivine, it's polluted, it's nasty. The tantrics, they said, God is in the body. Everything that we're going through in life is divine, is holy, is sacred. And the tantrics were the ones who said, that moksha, or liberation, can happen in one lifetime. Whereas previously in yoga was taught as like, you could spend a whole lifetime in a cave and maybe you'll get there. Probably not. And probably what will happen though is that you'll be reincarnated, you'll become a Brahmin male priest, and then you get another chance at it, or maybe you just reincarnate as a cow, and that's cool too. But the tantrics, they really revolutionized everything, and they said women can practice yoga. At that point in time, women were able to teach yoga. They brought yoga to households, and the coin was really, like you said, Bronwen, flipped in the sense that like yoga or the body became divinized, and that was a really radical time in yoga. And it produced some of the most amazing texts, beautiful texts. It also produced some of the most amazing material, including the chakras. And then Islam invaded India, and overnight, Tantra was just basically squashed because of its kind of revolutionary ideas. and particularly taken back away from women and a lot of other things. And then, gave rise to finally another form of yoga called Hatha yoga. So that's kind of my understanding of non-duality, and the little bit more context with it. But what I can say is that I feel like, as modern day practitioners, almost everybody is probably practicing some form of non-duality. Maybe there's some of us who are engaged with more of like indigenous religions, which tend to be more dual. And again, like that the duality aspect being, God is outside of us, or we're making sacrifices to gods for favors or for good luck or for prosperity. These non-dual philosophies again turn us inward and say, God, spirit, universe is within us. And I think we can point back to, Isui Mikeo's revolutionary experience or transcendent experience on Mount Karuma, and you can say that was a realization of a non-dual aspect of God, whereas like he realized, I am the universe is me. And that's really in line with yogic philosophy as well, and particularly around the chakras. The chakras are thought of as this divine map. And so as we awaken our chakra system, it's like looking at ourselves through the lens of the cosmos, and then also the cosmos looking back at us through the lens of ourself, which is, pretty out there, but pretty awesome too. So that's my understanding of non-duality from yoga.
Thank you so much for that, Carrie. I love, finding those little sparks of connection, which is so much about what this is about, right? Interconnection from disconnection. That last point that you made about the chakras being a map, I always think about the 3 diamonds, the 3 energy centers that are present in Shinto and therefore in Reiki as being like a map, and being, mapping that same energy system that the chakras do, but putting it through a different lens, connected to the 3 symbols and mantras, as Bronwen mentioned earlier. The first symbol connected to the first diamond, connected to earth, the earth energy, the second diamond connected with the head and with the second symbol and mantra with heaven energy, and the third, that non-dual interconnected space in between at the heart. So just kind of, again, seeing those connections. I feel the connections to my own lineages in Celtic spirituality, where God is seen as within us, beside us, above us, below us, within us, around us, and blurring that line, as you said, between matter and spirit, and seeing that we don't have to experience ourselves as isolated from that. It's not that we have to, change to a completely different state of being in order to be connected to divinity, that we simply need to remember and turn towards the divinity that's inside of us. And then Brahman, the idea of, enlightenment in one's lifetime, that Carrie, that you mentioned being part of Tantra, and that revolutionary idea, that was also a concept that came through Shingon Buddhism, the first, fully Japanese form of Buddhism that is, associated with Reiki. Again, that idea that enlightenment could happen in a single lifetime if one diligently, continues to practice and rest one's attention on non-duality, on the connection of opposites, the dissolving, the dissolution of the perception of opposites, of things being either good or bad, right or wrong, up or down, and the sensation of the coming together of things that seemingly are separate, including us, right? The coming together of life in, out of a perception that we're inherently separate. And these are, some of the esoteric, the concepts that are present inside of this concept of non-duality, that can seem a little bit like abstract, right? A little bit unattainable. Like, what does that have to do with our actual life? And what does that have to do with our practice? And so I just really love exploring that. And there's 3 areas that come up for me right away that I'd love to explore as we continue our conversation. But I'd love first to hear, Bronwen, what you drew from Carrie's overview that she just shared.
Yeah, well, I know that Carrie, if we go back to the beginning of what non-duality, I think it's Advaita. Is it Advaita in
Right. And I was looking that up, and it's pronounced something a little bit different, and pronunciation is very important to some yogis. So let me pull that up. Hold on a second. Oh shoot, I lost. I think it's called, oh yeah, it's Advaita.
Veda.
Yeah. Which means non-two.
Yeah, that's
not
interesting.
Yes.
Not to. Yeah. Or not to. So non-dual. And I thought that was an interesting way of saying something, that it's not two, yeah. But if it's not two, is it one, right? But if it's one, then there are other numbers, right? So it can't be one either. So it sort of has all that, there's a lot I love all those little, thoughts and how that all fits together. So really what we're looking for is not anything, I guess, right? Not two, but not three, not four, not one, not anything. And we're looking for this emptiness and this space. And, if there is a world with unending space, then that is the world that is a non-dual world. Yeah. And it means that there's the potential for anything, and that it's always that I don't know, that everything is shifting, moving, but forever to eternity, and so trying to actually feel what this idea is of non-duality, and what this oneness is, is something that, as you were talking about practice, it's about working through your practice. But for me, it's very much practice as everyday practice, not just my formalized practice, the non-formalized practice as well, and how important that is, because if we're only doing it if we're only working at that sometimes, then we're working in a dual experience. If we work in a non-dual experience, then we are there is no limit. That's what I was saying. It's just this, and that is it. And so that is that sense of always perpetual, the eternal present.
Yeah.
And
the very foundational practices within the system allow us to start having a sense of that, right? Like not just the idea of it, but the feeling of it. And so the Jushin Kokyoho practice for me has always given me this sensation of there being more space inside of me, and then, oh, there's more space around me, and oh, it's all the same space. And there's this continuous opening into spaciousness when being in that practice on a regular basis. And that's how I've come to describe it with other people. And then it's like, what is the impact that has on our life? What does it mean to our life to be in a practice that has us feeling more spacious, more, bigger inside? And, a couple of things that come up right away is having the ability to hold multiple emotions that might seem in conflict at the same time. We talked last week about grief and joy and holding those in the same space, and how if we can't do that, if we don't have enough spaciousness inside of us to let those emotions move through us, then we're going to get stuck, in one or the other, or we're going to not be able to feel them at all. I think about relationships and, times when we get into these intractable arguments where it's like, we just have to be right and the other person has to be wrong. And we spin around that argument over and over again, because there isn't room inside of us to think, maybe we're both right in a certain way. Maybe we both have, maybe we're both wrong in a certain way. Maybe there's room for both of these perspectives to coexist. And if we don't have that sense of there's enough room, there's enough spaciousness, there's enough possibility, as you said, for multiple truths to occur at the same time, then we get into these intractable arguments that can turn into feuds, that can turn into violence, that can turn into community-wide, conflict, that can turn into wars. So it's the sort of sensation, the sensation that there's always got to be an opposite. There's always got to be a right and a wrong, a good and a bad, a like me and a not like me. And if it's like me, it's good. And if it's not like me, it's bad. These are fundamental perceptions that our biological mind naturally does as a way of helping us sort and understand the world, which is a good thing, right? We have an amazing capacity to sort and understand the world really quickly so that we can navigate and make decisions and make sense of the world. But the flip side of that is this separation, this sensation of difference, this sensation of disconnection, and the real, long-standing intractable problems that causes for us. And so part of a practice like this lets us take, full capacity of our animal brain that can, operate in these biological ways, and at the same time have a different, more spacious experience. As Carrie, as you were saying, have that experience of both matter and spirit at the same time. The capacities of the body and the capacities of the spirit happening at the same time. And the impacts on our daily life touch every aspect of life. They touch our relationships, they touch our emotional life, they touch our experience with nature and with the seasons, right? All of a sudden we see that it doesn't just go from, winter to spring to summer to fall. There's this beautiful gradation that happens. There's these tiny moments of connection from one season to the next, from one process to the next. And life becomes more full. It becomes more rich. It becomes more possible.
And it's never the same, which is really amazing if you think how spacious must this world be for things never, ever to be the same.
That's right.
Profound, so profound.
And what happens in our heart and our mind when we live that way, that like it doesn't have to be the same all the time. That change, that transition is good, right? And there's space for it, right? We're big enough to navigate that.
Yeah. I'd say one more thing about the philosophy, just because of what you've been pointing to, Michaela, is that from the Yoga Sutras, one of actually the texts that was very influential to the Yoga Sutras, and I know this just from studying with somebody named Chris Tompkins, who's a UC Berkeley scholar on Sanskrit and yogic history and philosophy and texts and stuff like that. But anywho, for the Yoga Sutras, one of the foundation texts, or one of the texts that was highly influential, was the Heart Sutra. And if you're familiar with that text, it basically says that everything is empty. So we're speaking to these same things. And so, of course, Reiki is a much more modern healing technique, but it really is embedded in these very deep and rich philosophies from thousands of years ago.
We work with the Heart Sutra a lot in our practice. We always chant with it in our Shampinan classes and, kind of use it as a way to demonstrate some of these concepts.
So true.
Just also looking at the this idea of what we're made of, and both of you have sort of spoken about that, and I didn't go into that at the beginning, but this idea of heaven and earth, that we are a blending of this heaven and earth to create us, and so this idea that we come from the heaven and the earth. And so it's that inside outside thing that we were talking about, for example, that Joshin Kokyoho does teach us practically how to experience. And we can look at the earth and we can see how we're not separate from the earth. So we are made up of the same what do you call that? The same elements that the earth is made of. And it's as if we have over time simply organically moved into this shape and being and from the earth, you know, and there actually is no difference. It's as if we're more of a conscious how does that say that again?
We're a conscious toadstool. We're a little mushroom with a mind.
But yeah, I mean, we're a conscious manifestation of, or not, we're not always conscious, but you know, we are a manifestation with some consciousness of the earth. And I think that is so beautiful. And you know, we go back to the earth. We come from the earth, we go back to the earth. And you know, we forget this total interconnection that we have, also physically with everything. And perhaps we are, perhaps it is the earth that is conscious actually, rather than us. Yeah. And we're just a way of expressing that, because we come from that. So what is coming from us comes from it, you know, and it's just our way of expressing that. And because we're human and this is our makeup, then we're expressing it in our own way.
I love that so much, Bronwen. And, you know, a while back, you wrote the most beautiful blog article called "And the Universe Replied."
Oh, yeah.
And we have used that article in every Shodan Reiki 1 class that I've ever taught. And we use it as a guided meditation. And we have people, you know, feel that sense of the earth, that sense of the heavens, that sense of that dualistic separation between them. And then that sense of them coming together, you know, as compassion, as the heart. Yes. And then, you know, ending with the Reiki precepts as like the answer. What does this mean? What does it mean to be this, to live this? Well, this is a description of what that way of being is, you know, as embodied and expressed through the precepts. And I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for that piece, because it's just so beautifully written. It's so evocative, and it tells the Shinto origin story in such a, you know, concise way that's easy to kind of pick up and work with, at least on an introductory level, and has been a really valuable tool for us. So for folks watching, I would recommend that you look up on International House of Reiki's blog "And the Universe Replied" for that piece of writing. But in that, you know, we really get to, again, work through this map of the way in which the universe and our own bodies, our own experience can be, you know, there's analogies there, right? And we want to be careful not to completely anthropomorphize everything. It's like, it's all about the human experience, right? Because part of non-duality is like softening that attachment to our own perception of things, right? But we have to begin where we are, you know, where we are is we have our own perception, our own way of understanding things through a human lens. And a metaphor like that, you know, and using our own body, our own physical experience, to understand how these things might be perceived differently than we do on the day-to-day can be really helpful, really beneficial place to start.
Yeah. And I think, you know, going to that part of like, how is this applicable in my life, and how, you know, how does it help me live a better life? You know, I for years, it was like, what the heck is non-duality? I mean, it just like scratched my head, and, you know, I read the blogs and I look it up, and I'm just like, okay, whatever, you know, and just, I mean, you can understand it on an intellectual level, but like Reiki, we can understand it on an intellectual level. We could talk about it all day long intellectually, but it's when you have this really profound experience of it, that's so transformative, right? It's, the words don't really mean anything until you can embody the teaching and what it points to. But for me, I always start in my mind, you know, and duality is like a state of mind that we can very easily slip into. And I think, Michaela, you were really pointing to it, is like when I'm angry, you know, I can have that sense or feeling that that's all that is. Like I can be so fixated on it, and I can feel so like stuck in that emotion that, you know, joy is very hard to find, or happiness very hard to find, or peace very hard to find. But, you know, when our mind is in a non-dual state, we can actually hold both. And from the yogic worldview, that's entering our higher mind. You know, our lower mind is this one that's stuck in the opposites of, I'm having a bad day today, or and tomorrow's going to be bad too, or, you know, like some people in the wellness world are like, on cloud 9 every day of their life, which there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes they have a little hard time reaching down to people who suffer from, depression and lower vibe days or grief. They just have a hard time reaching those people or being able to understand each other. Like they're like oil and water. But so, shifting into a non-dual state of mind, we begin to see like things through that whole state. And a lot of it also points to Taoism, the essential philosophy of the Yin Yang, and the symbol of the Yin Yang is there's the dark and the light, and there's a little bit of light in the dark. There's a little bit of dark in the light, but all of it is roomed in consciousness. And so consciousness is the container that holds all of the emotions, holds the night and the dark, or light and the day. It holds the male and female in that state of oneness. And so it's through understanding, yes, like the dark aspect, we also turn back towards light. But ultimately, I think the goal is to transcend those opposites and into that place of oneness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how describing that and how that's relevant. And I think it's like if I'm saying, if in my life I'm going, oh, I really want to be rich, I'm going to do everything I can to be rich. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. But in my doing that, I'm creating this dual experience, right? So actually what I'm saying is, oh God, I'm scared of being poor. My fear is poor, poverty. So that's actually what I'm living in when I'm thinking that I'm living in, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and to, make myself rich to do this, and by doing that, I'm actually living in this other world. And it is one of fear. And so I'm trying to get out of one to be in another, and it's just working between these things the whole time. And rather than, I used that word before, like the eternal present. If we could transform our thoughts and not have to create these opposites in our lives, which is very difficult because language in itself is something which is dualistic, I think,
English in particular.
Possibly.
Very linear.
So it how to even that idea of trying to be in nirvana, trying to be in this eternal present is me being fearful of not being in that eternal present, or worried that I won't be in that eternal present, that I'm not successful in my practice. So if we're looking at it in practical terms, we can see how difficult that is to actually embody the experience. And that's why we have practices like, Michaela, you were saying Joshin Kokyuho, which gives us that that embodiment of that experience.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and when we're stuck in that place that you were just describing, where we're fearful of one state, and so we're casting our mind into the opposite of that state, and then we're not really able to be fully in the actual reality of the experience of where we actually are. There's a lot of suffering inside of that, right? There's a lot of dissatisfaction inside of that. And I'm really honored to have received a story this weekend that's just really been coming to my heart and my mind as you've all been talking. And I think I'd love to share it in this context, because I think it gives us another kind of real life example of what non-duality like in our daily life might look like. And it was a story that my nephew told me at his brother's high school graduation party that we were at this weekend. And I just love this young man. He's such a compassionate, kind, just brilliant young man. I feel so privileged to be in his family. And he was sharing that a couple summers ago at his summer camp, a good friend of his actually passed away, like at camp, like at the summer. And that was, of course, an incredibly traumatic experience for all of the other kids there. And I think my nephew was a counselor actually at the time. And so he talked about just the experience of kind of being in a community of grief, like all together in that time, and how grateful he was that, if that experience had to happen, that it happened while they were in community, while they were out in nature. And it was a camp that had a Jewish kind of container. Like, not everybody who was there was Jewish, but there were practitioners on site and among the staff. And so they were able to kind of put a bit of a spiritual container around what was happening, and speaking to a lot of these concepts around non-duality that we've been discussing with relationship to grief. And what he described was that at the end of that experience, and after coming home from that experience at camp and reflecting back on that summer, that a lot of his friends talked about how that summer was just completely ruined, right? Like that incident, understandably, had just colored the entire summer and maybe even the year to come. And that there was just this grief and this sorrow and this sadness and this difficulty about that whole experience. But my nephew said that he didn't feel that way. He felt that the grief had been very acute and it was very real. It's not that he turned away or numbed it out. He'd really been with it, but he could take a little bit of a wider view, and he could see that there were, happy and joyful moments even at camp that, in those weeks. And that, there were other moments with his family that were joyful, and other moments that were just kind of boring and regular. And, he could see this tapestry of life that had happened that summer, and hold that grief alongside all of the other aspects of life. And I, had asked him, like, why do you think you were able to do that? Like that sounds really mature, like that you were able to see, feel the grief, not turn away from it, but feel it in this larger context of life happening and expressing itself in all of these different ways. And so we had this really lovely conversation about what might have been the factors that caused that to be true for him. And we talked about non-duality, and we talked about perspectives on grief from both, his background in the Jewish faith and what I've been learning about in Japanese perspective and Celtic perspective, and finding those really beautiful points of intersection between these different faith traditions around, essentially the idea of non-duality and the idea of making spaciousness in our life for all of life to get to happen inside of us and around us without shutting any of it down, right? Because we're saying that part's bad, this part's good. And maybe I'm so caught up in the bad, I can't see the good, or vice versa. And that just like, it was such a beautiful example of what, having a non-dualistic experience in the middle of our day-to-day life can look like, and the value that can have for us.
I see that as probably a parallel between living a dualistic experience is possibly a reflection often of the dramas that we create, the stories that we tell ourselves. And that sort of says that it's sort of like he stepped out of the drama and the stories and the, it would be very easy to get caught up in a lot of that, especially with others, when you're sharing stuff, but instead not going with the drama. It's
a good way of looking at it. Drama as dualism.
Right. Well, I think it's such an important philosophy to really understand in conflict. And I know that, for myself, I tend to be a little clairaudient, and I had a Reiki client once who came to a session, and she expressed a desire to work with, embracing her feminine nature. And I thought that was a beautiful intention. And what was so interesting, while I was giving her Reiki, I felt her sensed Reiki share with me that, male or female, we're human. And I think in that desire for her to be, embrace this feminine aspect of herself, there was also some polarization happening. And I mean, of course, that's totally natural, right? But for me, just like everything, that message was for me as much as it was for her, because, in my life, like the way I was raised and, especially in my childhood, there was a lot of polarizations between male and females. just in a like incredible amount, just related to sexuality and, lots of different ways and purpose and, our place and what men are supposed to do, what women are supposed to do, etc. And so I've always really struggled with a feeling of separateness, between male and female. And that was like a really big moment of healing for me. It's just being able to like really drop the walls and the barriers and see, male counterparts, my male counterpart as human too.
Yeah.
And really reaching across the aisle. And so I do want to say that in the context of the Reiki Women podcast, because I know we haven't even touched this topic yet, but it's something that I think maybe someday we'll talk about, but is, why women as opposed to men. And somebody questioned me about this week. And, it's so interesting because, we can have our explanation. Of course, women's voices have often been stifled but I don't think our intention here is really to polarize Reiki men or Reiki women, but just to really give a source of leadership for Reiki women, give a platform for Reiki voices, Reiki women voices. And it's not to say that we don't want to hear men's experiences or that their experiences aren't valid or they're not part of the community. I think that...
No, I think it's about balance, Carrie, right?
Exactly, right?
Polarization.
Yeah. Well, and from a perspective of non-dualism, right? Like part of that is being able to hold different aspects of our experience in the same space. So from a, spiritual perspective, from an experiential perspective that we've been speaking to, we can really lean into non-duality. At the same time, we can acknowledge that we live in a dualistic world that has caused, pressures on certain groups of people that have caused real negative impact, and that we can create different systems that help to alleviate some of that negative impact, such as creating a space where women's voices can be centered. And at the same time, we can explore, like what you just said, Carrie, that we're all human. So here we have a space that is explicitly inviting female identified people to speak. And one of the topics that has come up several times, in fact, this came up in one of our very first conversations when we were talking about, what does it mean to be a Reiki woman, that all of us, rejected some version of being pigeonholed into one definition of what being a woman means, or one particular type of role that a woman needs to play, or anybody of any gender needs to play. And so we can hold both of those, right? We can create a space that pushes back against structural inequities that have come about because we live in a dualistic world. And inside of this space that we've created, we can explore, what does it mean to be non-dual? What does it mean to push back against the idea that women have to be one sort of way, or men have to be one sort of way, or we have to identify as either of those things? So, we can do both of those things at the same time.
Sure.
The world is spacious enough to include all of that. Absolutely.
And you Reiki men, you can start your own podcast if you really want.
Oh god. Anyway, but it is funny, isn't it? But I think it's a fascinating conversation. And I was just looking at this thing about what is a woman, and also in some of the snapshots that's come up, because I think people are thinking, well, what does that mean? What am I going to talk about? What aspect of me means woman? What part of me is woman? And I think it's fascinating. What we create, stories we create, but also, if we look at humankind, if we look at the world of animals, there's all different species, yeah. But within a species, there's all different sorts of, you can break things down again and again and again and again, to infinitely to an individual, I guess, because we are all different. Everybody's different, and we're all slightly, if we were to look at this is the way I see it. If we were to look at women, some of us have more testosterone than others. Some of us have, we are not the same.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's that same thing going back to like the seasons, right? Like it's not just summer and winter, right? Like there's this gradation. And so it's not just 100% female, 100% male. Those are separate entities. There's this gradation and there's this overlapping and this blending. And so again, in a certain sense around our time-bound, culture-bound, history-bound experience, it can be helpful to make these distinctions, especially when there's been systemic oppression of one type of person over others. And at the same time, we can use that space to discuss what does it mean to blend those definitions and to soften the edges, those hard edges of what it means to be one thing or another, make more space for there to be a more broad conversation about it. And I love that we're choosing to do that here.
Totally.
Yes. May it
Yeah,
continue.
it just, I think one other thing I can mention about it too is that there's one of my teachers, Harish Wallace, he talks a lot about non-truths or mistruths or just little ways in which truths are distorted and they really make things untrue. And one of these is this perception of like, well, what's the goal of enlightenment? What's the aim of enlightenment? And a lot of times people seem to point to that enlightenment is like, oh, once I'm enlightened, I'll be like my better self. I'll be my higher self. I'll be something different than I am. I'll be, my sparkly crown chakra self. And both within the philosophies of yoga and this concept of non-duality, the truth is enlightenment is to have these realizations of oneness, is to actually shed the whole ego of ourself anyway, of our personality, of who we think we are, and recognize like at the core, we're the universe, and that the magic, the light inside of us isn't, this higher version of ourselves, this egocentric, self that's really built on power over others. It's built on oneness and unity and that divine self in all things. And so I think that there's sometimes a lot of mistruths around that. And especially, I'd say within Reiki, sometimes that focus on angelic healing and working with angels and, non-spiritual or spiritual entities. Sometimes I think we get stuck in that place of really kind of putting something else on a pedestal rather than the own intuition and our heart and minds. And I know we've talked about that concept many times, but that sometimes that's also
it makes it feel so unattainable, right? When we think about it in those terms, and that we need all of this external support to like get there, and enlightenment takes many lifetimes. And it's like, when we think about it as like, what we're talking about is remembering something that's always true, something that is already so, that we have forgotten, that we've been distracted from. And so enlightenment is remembering that we're already that. We're already whole. We're already connected to absolutely all of life. And we're already completely resourced all the time. And when we have those moments of feeling that, of plugging into that, the sensation of that, like every one of those moments matters. It doesn't have to be this huge revolutionary, transformation of everything forever, right? If we have one moment where we feel that sense of deep connection and we feel that sense of remembering that I'm always that, I've always been that, I always will be that. And sometimes I forget, or most of the times I forget, that matters, right? It matters. It changes us little by little. And so, yeah, I love just bringing it back. And, that's not to say that if concepts like angels or other types of, personifications of energy and of concepts aren't, useful for folks to help focus the mind. But I think that you're right to point out, a tendency to cling on to that and to make that the point of the practice when, at least for me, and I have found it more beneficial in my actual day-to-day life to really bring it back to a simple process of trying to remember who I am, and to feel connected to other people in that.
Yeah, the symbol one, the first mantra, in the system of Reiki. In Shinto, it means return to kami. Yeah. So return to the God in yourself, if you like. Yeah. And I think that's what you're talking about. really. Yeah.
Mhm.
And that is then that eternal present. So it's, you know, it's not a God as in an old guy with a white beard, you know, and it's just about that space in ourselves that we have it. We talk about the remembering, you know, remembering who we really are, that purity inside of us. And we all have that. And the earth has that. And everything has that, you know. So it's that returning to that and being in that space perpetually.
It's a beautiful place for us to close, Bronwen. Thank you for that.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you for sharing all those wonderful ideas. I love that we never know where it's going to go. That's the fun of it, right? So thank you for sharing. Hey,
It's always a fun time. It's one of my highlights of the week. Having this little.
I'm loving it.
Mhm.
Thank you for sharing that with me and with each other. Yep. And anyone who's watching, thank you for sharing as well with us. And you know, apparently we've been talking about this at one point. If you now, Michaela, get me right on this. If you like the YouTube thing video, then it raises its consciousness in the YouTube world. Is that
yes, we would like more folks to get to be in on this conversation, to think about these ideas, apply them to their own life. And so, you know, all of the different ways that these systems have of making that happen, which includes subscribing to this channel, liking this video, sharing it with somebody you think would be interested in this topic. If you're listening on Spotify or a podcast platform, leave us a review, leave us a 5-star review there. That helps them to know to show this to more people. And, you know, again, sharing it around with folks that you think would be curious about these topics really is the best way to get it in front of more people and expand the conversation. We would love to hear from you. What have been your experiences around duality or non-duality? Are there examples from your life that you can think of where you had a moment of softening those hard edges between, you know, the opposite feelings that we often have in the world? We would love to hear from you and continue the conversation down in the comments. And we will be back next week with a topic that we don't know what it is yet, because it always just reveals itself to us in the right moment. But we look forward to that conversation.
Yeehaw. Thank you. All right. See you later, guys. Mwah.
Have a great week.
Bye, friends.
Next time.